Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church, and we are in Romans. We're going to be in Romans for probably a few weeks here. We're in Romans 2:17 through 29, and this is looking at the Jews and the law. If you watched yesterday's video, it was God's judgment of sin, and he transitions into the way the Jews are with the Old Testament law and their boasting and different things like that. So we're going to read that, look at some notes, and we will go from there. So Romans 2:17 through 29. You may call yourself Jews, or you who call yourselves Jews are relying on God's law, and you boast about your special relationships with Him. You know what He wants, and you know what is right because you have been taught His law. You are convinced that you are a guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. You think you can instruct the ignorant and teach children the ways of God, for you are certain that God's law gives you complete knowledge and truth. Well, then, if you teach others, why don't you teach yourselves? I'm going to vary off my notes a little bit here, just on this one. This stands out to me because I think this can apply to ourselves sometimes today as Christians. Is because I think if you go back and look at this the previous section, right? This like we could if you take in the Jews and replace it with Christians and still use God's laws and things, a lot of these things right here, it's we can apply the same thing to us in many ways, right? It's just, why don't if you teach others, why don't you teach yourselves? And it's kind of sometimes, again, we're not going to be perfect as Christians. That's I'm not calling for that, but sometimes, right, especially what we present to the world is do as I say, not as I do. And so this is what Paul's kind of calling them out to. And so we need to pay attention to this. He says, you tell others not to steal, but do you steal? You say it is wrong to commit adultery, but do you commit adultery? You condemn idolatry, but do you use items stolen from pagan temples? You are so proud of knowing the law, but you dishonor God by breaking it. No wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of the God because of you. And I think sometimes, right, again, I'm not trying to come down too hard on Christians and the church, but we still have to pay attention and look in the mirror of what's going on a lot of times in the world today. Now, I think it's getting better. I think it's a lot better than it was 5-10 years ago. If I'm being honest with you, but I think sometimes we can say that the world, blasphemes the name of God because of some of the things that the Christians do, and and so we've got to be careful, and I think we've got to learn to start calling this stuff out. I think for so long it happened because we just allowed it to happen. And we've got to stop allowing these things to happen inside our churches, inside our leadership, inside of a lot of these things. We've got to stop letting them happen. We've got to call them out. And so he continues on. The Jewish ceremony of circumcision has value only if you obey God's law. But if you don't obey God's law, you are no better off than an uncircumcised Gentile. And if the Gentiles obey God's law, won't God declare them to be His own people? In fact, uncircumcised Gentiles who keep God's law will condemn you Jews who are circumcised and possess God's law but don't obey it. This section here is and man, there's so much you could dive into deep here. You just understand the background, the understanding of the difference between the Jews and the Gentiles, and how much the Jews did not like the Gentiles. To sit here and for Paul to write to the Jews and say, look, the Gentiles, uncircumcised Gentiles, will be condemning you, right? You Jews, right, who are circumcised, and you have the law, right? You have all this stuff. You've done these things, and I would kind of parallel it to in today of like the Christian who's baptized and goes to church every time the doors open. It's like, just because you do those things, just because you go through the acts, just because you know the law or the word of God, right, doesn't mean that doesn't make you a Christian. Just because you say you're a Christian doesn't make you a Christian. And so it's the same thing with the Jewish parallels that Paul's using here. Just because you say you're a Jew and you're circumcised doesn't make you a Jew. Doesn't make you, one of God's people. And so he continues on. He says, for you are not a true Jew just because you were born of Jewish parents or because you have gone through the ceremony of circumcision. And I think this parallels with us today, right? Just because you've gone through the motions, right? Just because you've gone through the ceremony, right? Or said the right words to become a Christian doesn't make you a true Christian, right? It says, no, a true Jew is one whose heart is right with God. And that is, we've got to highlight that. A true Jew is one whose heart's right with God. And true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law, rather it is a change of heart produced by the Spirit. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not from people. So this is a very deep section to the Jews, right? And although he's writing to the Gentiles in Rome, he knows the Jews are going to be there's going to be Jewish people who are going to be reading this, and so the boasting of the Jews here reflects Old Testament and Jewish teachings about the privileges and responsibilities God gave to Israel. They had responsibility. They were God's chosen people. They had special responsibilities. They were to behave in a certain way. They were given the law. They were to obey that law. And so, because he did that and entered a special relationship with them and commissioned them were to be the light to the Gentiles, right? They were not wrong to enjoy these blessings. The error was in failing to live up to their privileged position. They had a position of privilege, being God's chosen people and being given the law, right? And so Paul, he gets on to them for failing to practice what they preach. They say all these things, but they're not practicing what they preach. And so when I say I parallel that to a lot of us today, sometimes in the Christian world, we say a lot of things, and a lot of it's do as I say, not as I do. And so so Paul was getting on to him, and I think we can parallel this. We need to pay attention to this. And he zeroes in on the main problem with the Jews, and that is they fail to practice the law they proclaim, and so they're going to face judgment for that, and so will we, right? So will we, and so we need to be very careful. Their boast in God was null by their failure to obey him. And so one of the things he talks about, and I just want to hit on this because it's an interesting fact, I think, more than anything, is he's like, do you use the stolen items from the pagan temples? And what it was, the Old Testament prohibited the Jews from having anything to do with pagan idols, but some of these first century, didn't follow this. In fact, they would steal the idols and they'd steal the precious metals and stuff from them. And so they went on that. And in verse 24 here, 224, Paul quotes I'm sorry, he uses this passage to demonstrate the failure of the Jews to live up to their responsibilities. Right? God instituted the Jewish I can't talk today ceremony of circumcision as a sign of his covenant with Abraham, and it was to be performed by the male Israelite children. It parallels it parallels baptism today, right? The males, in this sense, were to be circumcised as part of the Jewish custom, right? And if you were uncircumcised, you weren't considered a Jew. And in today's world, I parallel with baptism, right? All Christians are commanded to be baptized, and so I would say if you're not baptized, it's hard to claim to be a Christian, right? Because you're not obeying the very basic command that we've been given you. And so they thought they were special for that, right? And just like I do, it's a special ceremony, I think, for us to go through today, where it's something we're commanded to do, and it's something we should do with baptism. And so I think these kind of parallel each other. But he's saying in all this, right? He's saying in all of this, and that it doesn't matter, right? Just because you're born Jewish and you are circumcised doesn't make you a true Jew, right? It doesn't. It's no value if the heart hasn't changed, and that's what he's trying to get at there. And so he's saying, look, there's you circumcised people are not going to be saved, and these uncircumcised people are going to be saved, which would have been an insult to the Jewish people who were reading this because they didn't believe that. And so, these Gentiles who are keeping the law but are uncircumcised, they're in better standing than you are, who are circumcised but you're not keeping the law. And so he gets down to that true circumcision or true change is a matter of the heart, right? He says, no, a true Jew, verse 29 there, is one whose heart is right with God. And that's what it boils down to. Old Testament, following the law, being circumcised, doing those things. That's what it came down to, is the heart, the condition of the heart. All of it goes back to the condition of the heart. It doesn't matter what you do. It's the condition of your heart. Same thing with being a Christian. You can say you believe, you can be baptized, you can go to church, you can give, you can even serve. But if your heart isn't changed, and that doesn't come out, and you don't live, right? Just because you do those things doesn't mean you changed your life. You can still be living in all kinds of evil ways and sinful ways and not have a changed heart. And that's what Paul's getting at here. Again, this applies. I think this parallels not only the Old Testament Jewish customs, but what we're commanded to do, and part of the being a Christian today. And so, I think that's why Paul is writing this. I think we'll see this as we get into it. And so, I just think that we have the letter of the law now through the Holy Spirit. We have the letter of the law written on our hearts, right? And so it's given it to it that way, and he talks about that, right? It's a change of the heart produced by the Spirit, and a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God and not from people. And so I just think we need to pay attention to this, us as Christians, right? And anyone looking to become a Christian, or if you're reading this, I'm not trying to come down hard on Christians, but I want us to understand the effect we have on the world. I mean, he talks about how the Jews, right, the way they behaved, even though they were given a position of, I won't say authority, but advantage, right, a position of advantage, because they were God's chosen people, they were given the law, and so they had an advantage over the Gentile and Gentile worlds. Now, doesn't mean the Gentiles couldn't obey the law, but they were still given advantage. And so their behavior by being hypocritical, very hypocritical, caused the Gentiles to even push further away. And I think we've got to be careful as Christians not to do that, right? Not to proclaim one thing and proclaim it and then do another. Now, again, we're not, like I said, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to sin. We're going to mess up, but we've got to minimize that and keep that from it, and not publicly just be completely hypocritical in the way we do things. And so I think that's what Paul's getting at here, around the Jews and the law, and moving this forward. And so he's going to continue on in this thought about how God remains faithful through all this. And so we'll look at that. Again, I hope this makes sense. I feel like maybe my thought process wasn't 100% clear on this one, but the main idea here is it's not just having the law and going through ceremonial processes, or keeping traditions, or keeping things, right, that save you. It's the condition of the heart, and that's what he's getting at, right? The Jews had the law, but they weren't obeying it. Many of them weren't obeying it, and he's saying you've got Gentiles who don't have the law, but they're obeying it, and they're not circumcised, but they're going to be judging you, right? And so I think we can apply, again, parallel this with the Christian world. We need to make sure, yes, there's things we're commanded to do, but in the end, it comes down to a change of heart. And if we have a true change of heart and a true faith, then all these things are going to come out of it. And we'll get into that as we move forward. So I hope this is helpful. As always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. That way, we publish these every morning. That way, you get them. And you can have this, we post at 5 a.m. so you have it all day, or try to publish at 5 a.m. and that way you have it all day to go through and read and study the Word. As always, appreciate all the comments, the encouragement, even some of the disagreements. I appreciate those. I don't mind those. It helps, I believe, with building a stronger faith and a stronger knowledge, because again, I'm not 100% right on all these things. No one is, but I do my best to study and come up with what we think this possibly could mean with some of these things. And so, again, I appreciate other points of view and thoughts on that. So as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch. I hope you all have a wonderful day.